Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges. The brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Welcome. Today's guest, I have a gentleman by the name of Mr. Frank Kalman. Frank is the executive director of an organization called End Kids Cancer. And it's really an amazing organization which he started, as a result of his own child getting cancer at 12 years old, which you'll find out in the podcast. And she's now 29. And he had to find out more about how to get the types of treatment that his daughter needed. And he began to do a lot of research and navigate with the internet and talking to doctors. And he has created this, I kind of look at it as like a clearinghouse for parents to contact this website so they can find tools to help their child and advocate for them. And Frank has done many years of research on government websites and researching hospitals and treatment centers. And he talks about his journey with his own child and how it affected his family, his own cancer treatment or not treatment, but his own cancer diagnosis for prostate cancer. So we talk about that too. And he is really an amazing guy. He's really dedicated his life to helping other people that have gone through this type of thing and will be going through it. So I highly recommend checking out his website, which we'll be talking about in the podcast. And he will help us to learn how to be an advocate for not only our children who may have a medical situation, but ourselves as adults. So please listen in. This is Frank Kalman. So Frank is the executive director of End Kids Cancer, as I've probably said in the intro. And how did this organization come about? I know that your daughter had cancer, and I don't know what age that first appeared, but she's now, this is the good news, 29. Correct. So I want to start the this interview with knowing that there's so much hope.
Yes.
And so how old was she when she was diagnosed? And tell me how this organization came about as a result of that.
Well, she was 12. She was complaining about a lump on her side. And I got the call that I expected I'll never get, but it was the call that that your daughter may have cancer, and I want you in LA tomorrow, the doctor said. After they removed the cancer, they said it was neuroblastoma, which is the most common cancer amongst infants, and it is a cancer of the nerve cells outside of the brain. So then she relapsed, and when your child with this disease relapses, that usually means a death penalty. They said that she wasn't going to make it.
How old was she when she relapsed?
9 months later.
Okay.
So might have been.
So you must have been absolutely terrified, of course.
13. Yeah, it was actually unbearable when the doctor, I wanted to shake it off when the doctor told us that. And my wife and I said, we're not going to accept that. Or at least we're going to exhaust everything in the world. If we had to live in a tent in Afghanistan, we were willing to do it. So I started zigzagging and I started living on the computer 24/7 until 4 a.m. every night. And the goal is to find doctors that were capable of, at least they're going to tell me something I wanted to hear, which is we can do something about this. Spent several years. Let me back up. within a year or two, we found alternative treatments on the other side of the country. These doctors ended up saving my daughter's life with unconventional treatments, treatments that were used for other cancers. She's relapsed since 6 times, had a total of 3 major surgeries, had over 100 weeks of chemotherapy, multiple months of radiation, and each time these doctors had brought her out. So the point I would like to make here, and which is critical, is don't accept what
Mm.
you're told first up front. Exhaust everything, and that's what we did. And so um, this eventually led to our foundation, as you know. We had made friends with a group of kids at the very beginning, about 10 of them that my daughter was buddies with, and slowly these children were dying. And then when that last child died, after picking myself off the kitchen floor, because in pediatrics or this particular group, the term their child had earned their angel wings.
Mm.
It was devastating.
Yeah.
And so we started. We had a chance meeting with a mutual friend who I'm very sorry to say is not with us today, Chris
Yeah.
Kennedy Lockford. Chance meeting with him, and he had taken an interest in my daughter and offered to help. And then when I told him the last child that we had known had passed away, he said, he goes, count me in. So that's when our foundation was formed. And
That's
let me back up. And then she since then has graduated from college, going through chemo, and is now married.
what a remarkable story. I mean, the idea that you were told numerous times, this is expect the worst here, and you didn't accept it. I think that's a really important message for any kind of diagnosis with people, is to do some extra research. Really, there's people that are doing alternative things all over the planet that, I mean, there's ways to look at these diagnoses that may not be just the first one that you get, that may not be accurate, and certainly in your case it was not.
No, and the worst, I never, when it comes to cancer, the term hope gets thrown around, you know, uh, and until you lose hope, until I lost hope, I had no idea how devastating that was. There was a point when we were still on the West Coast, and nothing was working for our daughter, and she was in terrible condition. She was being treated with huge levels of chemotherapy. Her immune system was absolutely gone, and she had developed an infection that was just creating all kinds of pain for her. And I remember saying, I got to get out of here after being for almost 2 months in the oncology ward, and just I needed to get out of the building because I felt paralyzed. And I remember thinking that I have to break down my life to 5 minutes. If I can make it to the next 5 minutes, I'm okay. And I remember walking on that parking lot and just feeling the sun and just appreciating that moment. And then I realized that you can manufacture hope. And the way you manufacture hope is through research. And we wrote a guidebook based on the things that I had learned from all these other parents whose children have cancer, from adults, and also from many of the medical professionals. So there are ways. The most important thing in a diagnosis is to confirm what anyone tells you. Just because they're your primary doctor doesn't mean it's correct.
What is the name of the book if parents want to start to read this, and where can they get it?
It's End Kids Cancer. Pardon me, Steps to Hope. That's the name of it. It's free. It's downloadable at our website. And it also benefits adults. And if you want it, we could cover that as well.
Yeah. And the website is endkidscancer.org.
Yes.
So check that out. There's lots of information on that website. So what were some of the alternative treatments that were tried?
Well, I don't want to give the impression it was herbal and stuff. Actually, we had
No,
about
I didn't get that. I mean, I thought maybe that could have
yeah,
been part of it, but it seemed like it was cutting edge kind of treatments.
right. Well, they were using drugs that were used for lung cancer. Thiamidor irinotecan wasn't really used for this form of pediatric cancer. So the doctors at Memorial Sloan Kettering thought that they should try this. And what was remarkable about it is typically when you get cancer treatments, you continue when you have a response within a reasonable amount of time. And this went on for like 14 weeks, no response. And our daughter's doctor, who I think is probably the leader in this disease in the world, said we need to stick with this. And finally it worked. And so when I say alternative treatments, I'm talking about chemos and other drugs that are used for other diseases, other forms of cancer. And that's what they've been very good at bringing into the mix of keeping my daughter cancer free.
How would he know to keep going for that many weeks? How did was it instinct? Was it just he'd seen results from that? It just seems like, or was she the first that he had, that
I
this
think
was
she might have
tried?
been the first. Um, uh, I, I since you don't have exact science, it comes down to judgment. And
Yeah.
and that's I don't know what was his criteria. I didn't ask him. I should have. I could still do that, but he said we need to stick with this, and we did. And down the road, she's relapsed a couple of more times, and we're using an ALK drug that's usually used for lung cancer as well, and that's worked. And that's what she's on right now. She's been on it for 2 years. Very little impact on her, and it's keeping the cancer at bay. So
You mean very little negative impact?
negative impact, yeah, in terms of side effects. I guess there are two things. There are two things that I wanted to point out to your listeners, and that is one of the most difficult things you will ever deal with. I did in dealing with your physician, and that is letting go and having to go to maybe another center or another doctor for other opinions. And that's hard because here you are thinking that this fellow or this doctor, this gal is trying to keep your daughter alive, and the last thing you want to do is insult them. But it's usually the good ones that are okay with it, because you have to never forget that your obligation to yourself and to your child is far greater than you offending a physician. And usually the good physicians understand what you're doing. You're fighting for your child, or you're fighting for your own life. And that is probably the most important, that's like the fundamental attitude change that I needed in terms of giving me the okay that if I hurt people's feelings, that's not my goal, but I want to find the cure for my child or for myself.
Yeah. So you did have some doctors' feelings that were hurt and some that weren't.
Right. I actually got fired by one. So,
Yeah, he got mad at you, huh?
and but I don't feel too bad because the treatment that they wanted to subject my daughter to was to my wife and I unacceptable at the time, and that was massive radiation treatment.
I don't really have a big science background, but it was
Uh,
pretty hopeful and fascinating. And so, I guess I'm sort of jumping into this because there's so much of it, and it seems like,
mhm.
and that it scares me. So I still want to, I want to look at it because I know a lot of people have to face this in their lifetime, whether it's themselves or a child or a loved one, another type of loved one.
Yeah. Well, I want to let me share with you the reason why I ended up writing the book. One is I ended up finding out that 1/3 of all cancer diagnoses are incorrect.
Oh,
400,000
that
people.
much?
Yeah,
A
yeah.
third, 30%. Oh man.
And I actually saw it. I mean, I actually I actually saw that when I would be going to Ronald McDonald houses and I'm talking to kids, and the kids are telling me I had seen 7 doctors. They didn't know what to do, or the mom's telling me uh, we had been to one of the world's renowned cancer centers on the West Coast, and they're giving my child the wrong chemo. So I had met 2 moms at a Ronald McDonald house in New York, and the one mom's telling me that, and was the inspiration for the book. The one mom's telling me that we live in the middle of somewhere in the heart of the United States, and and this is very common. The doctors told her that we are capable of handling this disease, and more than likely, this might be the first time they may have ever seen this disease, or uh, uh, so they so they proceeded to take care of her child, and she goes, we eventually realized that the treatments they were giving our child was incorrect, because they contacted one of the centers that were focused on this disease. And so then they made the transition and moved to the other center, and the child was getting the right chemo. But in the meantime, this child's body is getting destroyed by the wrong chemo. Then the mom standing next to her says, "Our story is identical. It's just that they killed my daughter. They were winging it."
Oh, oh,
This is very common. Instead of saying, we don't know, there's a center that might be on the East Coast or the West Coast. One of the functions our foundation performs is that when a child relapses, we get these emails and phone calls. Our child has relapsed, and what that means in the neuroblastoma world is that the child's survival rate is next to zero. But in this case, this was the last phone call I just got a few days ago. We were at somewhere in Texas, and the doctors said to take our child home and call hospice and let the child die in dignity. So, since we have probably the top guys in the world on our advisory board for this disease, um, we I called a doctor at Sloan Kettering, who's my daughter's doctor, and the dad called me back and said they have 3 options for my son.
mm-hmm.
Whereas the other center didn't, said go home and let your child die in dignity. So again, here's the same theme. You're finished, you're doomed, go home and die with dignity, as opposed to, you know what, if you go to PubMed, you might find some centers that are focused on this disease, and the likelihood of survival are significantly increased. Now, this is how you create hope. Uh, what I have learned in my journey is hospitals are very much like a department store. They make decisions on which diseases they want to focus on, like a department store. So they can't be the leaders in all diseases. It's impossible.
Right.
So the advantage of finding a center that is not only very experienced with disease, but the centers that are leading are on the cutting edge. And the reason why the cutting edge centers are so important when you're dealing with an extremely dangerous form of cancer is that these centers will usually be maybe 5 to 10 years ahead of the rest of the field. These centers have the top doctors in the field. They have the support staff that have the experience to evaluate the tumors and make sure it's accurately diagnosed. They have a staff of nurses that the smallest little problems they know how to handle. These typical problems outside at a center that is not experienced with this disease can become lethal. And they have a staff that knows what's going on in the rest of the world. So the treatments that my daughter was getting was on the very cutting edge. And the reason why the other kids at different centers, they may be 10 years behind and they have no idea what's available. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is these centers, the center you want to look for is a center that's focused on your disease, and they usually have the greater options in case your frontline treatment fails.
So these centers that they don't refer to other centers. It's what it sounds like. It almost sounds like there's not a central sort of
No.
way to like, other than your organization. It sounds like you guys have created something that people can contact and
Right.
find the right place.
Right. And the book that we wrote shows you how to find these centers for any cancer. I had one doctor review it, and he said this actually would work for any disease. One day I was goofing around on NCI's website and looking at the neuroblastoma, the disease we're focused on, and I came across this page that says NCI's funding of research for neuroblastoma. And it's a page where the government, and usually they have a team of doctors or a few doctors that are dedicated to each disease. And when the funding from the government goes out, they make sure it counts, or they try to make it count. And so these guys live in this environment. They've been living there for probably a decade. So they're pretty good at picking the treatments or the centers to support. So I start tabulating which centers were getting the money, the most money, and I did it for over a 3-year period, and just in case one center didn't get funding because the year before they got big money. So and I realized within that 40 minutes, I accomplished what took me 10 years. So the book shows you how to capitalize on that. When it comes to adult cancer, it becomes a little bit more difficult because there's so much money going out to so many different centers for so many cancer projects. So then you need to take that into consideration as the book spells it out, and then start looking for the centers. And you can see this on clinicaltrials.gov, another source that the book points out. You start seeing who's doing the most research in that particular. You want to identify those centers that are doing the most research, and again, those are the centers that are usually years ahead of everybody else.
Here's an odd question. What were you doing before this all transpired?
I had a sales promotion business, and I was dabbling in real estate. I found myself unable to function in real estate just because I couldn't stand being around people. I really developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's common for parents, and a lot of parents don't know it. But so that's what I was doing prior to that.
And then this became your mission and your calling, it sounds like.
Well, yes, once we got the foundation going, it became a full-time job.
Yeah. I can only imagine the stress it would put on your marriage and everything, every relationship. It's just there's so much heavy pain that's just present 24/7.
It destroys families. It destroys families, and some families, some make it. My wife and I got stronger. We basically assumed our different areas of responsibility. She took care of the kids, and my job was to find answers for Callie.
So you have other children?
Yeah, 2 others.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's an effect on them also, because
Yes.
they see the parents in turmoil, and then they also are getting probably less attention than they would if they had a healthy sibling who didn't have this. I mean, it's a big, just something like this would get all on everything, basically. It's
Callie became the center of attention, and we were cognizant of that. And we're always trying to make the other two feel that they're just as important. It's just that Callie is sick, and we all got to pull together and driving that home. And I think it has had actually a positive impact on our kids. On the 2 other ones. One became a school teacher because she loves kids, and the other one initially after college went to work for Make-A-Wish as a fundraiser, and then she transferred over to the American Red Cross. She would have never, I don't think, ever thought of getting involved in nonprofits if it wasn't for the family experience.
Tell me about the symptoms of the PTSD that you suffered, and I'm assuming your wife also probably had a lot of that too, because you're with that heightened level. I mean, from what I understand, the body sort of fires a lot of cortisol all the time to have this heightened state. So
it could have a huge physical. It had a huge physical detrimental effect. You see, if you're not exercising, you could see the physical premature deterioration. Um, so that is something you have to keep in mind. Um, but I guess again, I'd like to, your listeners to know that probably hope without action is meaningless. And you can have, believe it or not, people are intimidated by doctors, they're intimidated by cancer, they're intimidated by science, and I knew none of that when I got into this. All I knew is if you stick your nose to the grindstone, you'll eventually start understanding the medical literature. And one thing I'm a little surprised about is how sometimes parents become too paralyzed. They don't reach out. They close in. Um, I'm not saying this to be bragging, but I've noticed the parents that I have. First of all, taking my child to the other side of the country sick was very intimidating. That to me was just like an I didn't even think that would be possible. I was just I didn't think I could do that. I didn't think I had the courage or whatever. But and then when I finally did it and we got to the other side of the country, we got to know parents, and there's a lot of parents like that are capable of stepping outside of the comfort zone, because you really, really need to step out of your comfort zone. And this is where you actually just pull the stops out. If you're going to beat this thing, don't take a half-ass approach, because this is something. If there's ever a time in your life you got to pull out the stops, it's this with this disease, because it will kill you if you're not aggressive in the fight.
So your recommendation to parents whose child has gotten this kind of a diagnosis would be, well, first to be aggressive about finding out options.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. But how would you say to take care of yourself, especially if you have other children and maybe you have to maintain a job? How do you do that on a day-to-day basis? Is there things that worked for you that were more successful than other things? I think you mentioned even exercise was one thing.
Yeah, exercise is important. And then the parents, you got to realize parents become the care managers. And this is the big difference between adults with cancer and adults with. Let me back up a little bit before we go any further. For example, I got diagnosed with prostate cancer a year and a half ago, and if it wasn't for the fact of what I had experienced, I would have been sniveling underneath the kitchen table. But I had seen what children had gone through, and I knew what question to ask and where to go. So the first things I did is I went to PubMed. Is a fantastic source. That's where all the clinical trials are posted.
Is that an acronym for something?
That's the name of a website where all studies concerning cancer research.
Say it slowly, so I didn't quite get it.
PubMed. MED.
PubMed.
And this applies to all people, all folks with all cancers. And then these are like my places to go for information. PubMed, and then I go to NCI's website.
That's the National Cancer Institute.
It's one division of the National Institute of Health, which is comprised of, I think, 26, 27 divisions for different diseases. And then they usually give you tutorials, very good tutorials, how the disease is working. But in terms of, I have experience that some of the recommendations for treatments are a little bit dated. And then I go to the two websites of the two leading cancer centers in the country. That would be MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering. And the beauty of that is you can see what the newest centers, what the leading centers are doing for that disease. But again, MD Anderson may not, in our daughter's case, wasn't the leader for her disease, but I used it for prostate cancer. And so by looking at those four websites, you start getting an idea what are the most current treatments, the latest treatments, and so that is how you get started. And then the book will show you, which is free, in a little bit more detail, how to get a little more accurate in your evaluation and in your search. So that's the approach: is find out what the latest centers, what the leading centers are doing, and then you want to confirm. The guy that you might, or the gal that you might see who's the doctor in your local hospital might be extremely informed. They may be the ones, they may be using the most appropriate treatments. So you don't know that. So the most important thing is always to confirm what is the best for you.
So it's really about being an advocate for yourself and not relying on the just on the doctor.
Right.
Make sure. I mean,
You want to,
really advocate, ask a lot of questions, and I like this idea of confirming, as much as possible, um, because it's just too big and wide of a field for one or two places to even have the answers, and it might just be a little bit different for each person.
yes. Yeah. Well, let me, probably a good story that illustrates what I'm talking about. As I told you, I got diagnosed with prostate cancer a year and a half ago, and by our local oncologist, and so right away I said I got to confirm. So I made an appointment with one of the leading guys in the world. He gives talks all over the world. He's in LA. I mean, he's in California, and he conducted a very flagrant uh, uh, diagnosis on me. First of all, the things that we advocate for in the book is you don't want a doctor relying on a pathology report from another center. You want them to evaluate the tumor. You want them to restart the whole evaluation process from the very beginning. You don't want them to rely on other scans. So this doctor took someone else's report, other MRIs, and didn't evaluate the tumor firsthand, and said we need to operate. And usually this kind of prostate cancer operation is pretty life-changing for many men, and it impacts your intimacy, your ability to even urinate, and all kinds of other significant problems, because when they have to pull the prostate out, it's a very complicated nest of nerves and stuff like that. So I realized a couple of things after I went to the websites that I described to you, is that 1/3 of all prostate cancers are misdiagnosed because a lot of doctors still today use random poking in the prostate. And I found out that a third of the time that's incorrect because they miss. And then I found out that if you are misdiagnosed or given a better rate of survival than you actually are, and then make the correction later on, you have a threefold higher risk of death if you get it wrong up front and you're not given the most appropriate treatment. So the most important thing is get it right. And then I found out by contacting Memorial Sloan Kettering and checking with the other centers, is that the top urologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering and the other top centers are using this approach called MRI fusion biopsy. Instead of the random poking, they take an MRI, they take of you previously, they stick a probe in your butt and use a ultrasound, and then they match to try to identify where actually the tumor is in your prostate right then live. And that's where they poke for the biopsy. And this reduces errors significantly. And then the other thing is men with prostate cancer, there's basically, this is oversimplification, but there's two types. There's a slow growing prostate cancer that it will outlive you, and it won't be a negative impact on you. For example, 70% of men, there was a study done on men 70 years old, and more than, I don't know the exact number, but more of them died with small levels of prostate cancer that had a zero impact on their life. So you can have prostate cancer and be fine. So then the next question was, since I come from an area of pediatrics where everything is determined by, you can get a more accurate picture of the profile of the cancer with analyzing the tumor itself. So then, in the disease we're focused in pediatrics, there's a lot of evaluation of the genetic makeup of the cancer. And I thought, why aren't they doing with prostate cancer? Not everyone is doing it. They're all doing it by visual evaluation, which is prone to error. So I found out that Memorial Sloan Kettering had developed a genetic test called the 4K, and then there were several others. And I found out that there was one I think they're in Utah, called Polaris. And this is the critical part, is they evaluate the tumor to determine the cell cycle progression, called Polaris. And that will tell you if that's a fast-growing tumor or the slow-growing tumor. So finally, after doing some more research, I found this doctor who my daughter's doctor said, you should maybe consider San Francisco. And everything I told you, the things that they wanted to start from ground zero, ignoring everyone else's research. They wanted to do their own biopsy, and then they wanted to do their own pathology on the tumor. And then they said, once we're done that, we're sending the tumors out for genetic analysis to determine if it is fast growing or slow growing. And that is exactly what I wanted to.
Wow.
So I went through all this, and then the urologist called me and says, why did they want to operate? Because we can't really find anything.
Mm.
So this is common. So on two major occasions in our life, if we would have taken the advice of the professionals, it would have been a devastating negative impact on our lives. One with my daughter, she's doomed, and in my case, but I'm just a small sample size compared to how many times I've run into this problem.
This is the way my mind works. Did you get back to the first doctor and go, you screwed it up?
No,
because you weren't thorough. You just went on.
Yeah, I just went on.
Yeah, I don't know if I would do that. I get mad about stuff like that.
Well, I was referred to him by a pediatrician. So I was just thinking before I started talking to you that it might not be a bad idea for me to tell him why I made the change.
Well,
not
yeah.
Any more people to him, and maybe like you said, it would sure be good for him to hear the feedback.
That's just the way I think.
I think I agree with you.
I had a guy once recommend somebody for, this is not medical, it was just some work around my house, and the guy came and he was awful, and he was not dishonest, and he was just, honestly, he was just not even a nice guy. So I called the original guy that recommended him, and I told him. He goes, "Oh, I'm really glad you told me. I won't recommend him anymore."
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Right.
So yeah. I don't, it seems even more important in the medical world, but I mean, sometimes you're just so caught up in the thing, you just don't even have time to go back and try to, correct somebody else.
How many times during the day or the week you'll be talking to someone about your insurance policy, about DMV, about anything, and then you find out they're not telling you the information. Mm-hmm. And it's so prevalent is because people just want to get you out of their face as fast as possible. They almost tell you anything. And so it's a flagrant advice. And that is so common. It seems like it's becoming more and more common when you doctor. So you have to drill down and see what makes you say that.
Right. Specifics.
Yeah. And I've heard this a couple of times. First of all, I have tremendous respect for most doctors. Some are dangerous and don't belong in the business because they're flagrant. But if you ever hear this, run like hell. And that is I think is the most common lie in medicine is, why are you thinking going there? We do the exact same thing.
Ooh, yeah.
How could you?
Big red flag, huh?
How could you say what's going on in that other doctor's mind?
You can't. Of course you can't.
Yeah. And just a minor change of opinion or attitude, not attitude or just knowledge, can make a huge impact on the outcome of your disease.
Now, let me ask you this. Tell me about the PSA test, what you've learned about that, because I've heard a whole range of things about its, effectiveness with diagnosis.
I probably read maybe close to 100 papers, if not more, on prostate cancer on PubMed. And back, I don't know, what was it, about 8 years ago, when they were saying that some of the top experts were saying, ignore a PSA test, don't even bother. And because of that, there was a big increase the following years of late stage prostate cancer diagnosis, meaning these guys are dealing with a tougher form of cancer. If they would at least maybe have taken a PSA test, they would have had a warning that it's not definitive. It's just saying, hey, something's going on. That's all the PSA test I'm in. My impression is there's something going on. So if you find big changes, then go the other step, which is maybe a biopsy. A biopsy is actually pretty awful, but it's important, and this is where a good experience center can make a big difference as well too. Just the biopsy alone can be dangerous if the center is not thorough in providing you with the protection with antibodies and whatever preparation you may need prior to the biopsy, and you develop an infection and you're dealing with a pretty serious form of infection. But the PSAs, I think, based on what I've read, is not indicative if you have prostate cancer, if you have high levels, and then you could have low levels of PSA and still have cancer. But just the idea that it's moving around or there's a change, it's a talk that you should have with your doctor.
So the biggest indicator of something is fluctuation in the numbers.
Yeah, that was, I remember my numbers initially for mine were like 2 or 3 or something, and the 4 is where you start going, hey, we need to pay attention. And so mine was under the 4, but I had read on NCI's website that if it changes more than 0.75 over a year period, you should have a talk with your doctor, even if it's below the 4. So I told my doctor about that, and maybe to get me off his back, he said, okay, go get a biopsy. And then that's, so it's kind of ironic is I thought I had something. I had a biopsy that they say that I had something. I almost had an operation that was devastating, and it turns out that it's probably nothing official.
I noticed on my when I get my yearly physical, and I have them do a PSA, but they have age ranges of where it should be by age. So they actually expect it to rise with age. I guess I don't know if that necessarily has to be that way, but that's how they sort of present it. Like maybe if you're 25 and years old and it's this number, that's kind of high for 25, but it's low if you're 60.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that's accurate or not accurate. I guess it's just based on statistics, I would imagine.
I wrote this book.
Yes. Yeah.
Based on what I had learned from other parents, other doctors, and our own experience. I sent a copy to the guy who Ken Burns based his movie on, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, who wrote this book called Emperor of All Maladies. And Ken Burns based a 3-part series called Cancer. And it was based on his book, and he's at Columbia, and his book had been a big hit. And I sent him a copy of this book, and he endorsed it and recommended it to Reader's Digest.
Wow!
I sent a copy. Yeah, thanks. And I sent a copy to then Vice President Joe Biden, and I got invited 6 days later to represent pediatric cancer at the Cancer Moonshot Summit, 2016. And then I sent a copy to the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and he said the book belongs in every pediatrician's office. So it's gotten great reviews. It's really just a simple, quick start guide to help folks. But there are two, and the doctors had said this will work for other diseases and in adults.
Yeah.
One of the first reviewers was a doctor of psychiatry, and I asked her to review it, and she goes, half of my patients would definitely benefit from this book. And I said, in what way? She goes, I had been trained at one of the top cancer centers in psychiatry, was at MD Anderson. And I've always told my female patients, and most of the women I'm seeing are women who have breast cancer, and they're dealing with it emotionally. So that's why they're seeing me. And I've always told them, you got to get out of this little town that we live in, or at least get the opinion of one of the leading centers like I'm telling you right now. And she goes, they don't, and they die.
Yeah.
And I said, why do they do that? And she goes, women have the tendency to think that the work they do to support the family or their needs are subordinate to the family needs, or they won't be. So they put themselves be subordinate to the rest of the family, and then they die when in fact they should be going to these centers. I told my wife the same what I just told you, and my wife said, I would have a hard time leaving you with the kids. And I said, well, isn't that short-sighted?
Well, of course it is, but I totally get it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
women, so this could be beneficial for women. And the other thing that the book talks about is adult kids have care managers. They're parents. Adults don't.
Right.
And then when you're dealing with chemotherapy, the impacts of the treatments, you don't have anyone that's on the internet looking for the latest and greatest stuff. That person who is your care manager, you need to have a upfront, frank talk with a spouse or family member and say, I am not going to be probably in condition to advocate for myself. I need your help. And that is so important, I think, in this whole process, is someone who is coherent and not impacted by the chemo and who can think rationally during visits. And this is the person that does the search at the NCI website or does the search and is kind of your third person care manager.
Yeah. It sounds like you've done a lot of that homework for people already, which is incredible. Just incredible. I think the whole field of patient advocacy is going to be growing. I hope it is,
I hope.
because people do need it. I mean, I had a friend who was a veteran who couldn't navigate the VA, and I just wound up helping him. He was an older guy.
Uh-huh.
He couldn't do it. It was just impossible. He didn't know how to do the computer, and he couldn't make
Oh,
appointments. And so I wound up doing it because he was a friend. But if he didn't have me as a friend, I don't know what, lots of stuff
wow.
wouldn't have gone his way.
So you're just what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You're a great friend of this gentleman.
Do you tour around and speak?
No,
Oh, okay.
I should. I'm thinking of doing it.
Because I mean, it's just hearing you talk is just so powerful. I mean, I don't know where that would be, and because I don't know much about it, but it seems like since you've been invited to to Washington
The
D.C.
White House.
and
Yeah.
all these places, and you're so knowledgeable and with so much experience, I'm going to encourage that.
Well, thank you. That's very
Yeah,
kind of you.
yeah. I mean, it's such important work.
Again, I knew nothing about. As a kid, I used to race motorcycles, and I do. And here's the beauty of sports: is the beauty of sports is that you learn that if you run into a problem, it's not nothing is insurmountable. You slam into the wall, and you figure out how to get around it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the beauty of sports. And so I was involved in motorcycle competition as a kid, and I competed against some of the fastest guys in the country. And so I think that attitude is something I think people should rely on in terms of their whatever sports or things that they were involved in before. You run into a challenge, you just say, okay, how am I going to get around it? And that's what this is all about. That's what the book's about.
That's fantastic. I have a friend that always says, if you find yourself in hell, keep walking.
That's right on the money.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for all the work you're doing. It's fantastic. And also, for this interview, it's really been um, a wonderful talk. I just really, I'm so impressed with the work you're doing in that book and how many years you've spent, simplifying it for the rest of us. Thank you.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you very much for the kind words.
Yeah.
So if any of your listeners want to get the book for free, all you got to do is go to our website. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be taking your part.
No, I want you to do this. This is good. It's not, no, why can't it be your part? Either one of us are getting paid. Who cares?
Go to our website, endkidscancer.org, ENDKIDS cancer.org. And if you go to our resource tab up in the upper right, you'll see Steps to Hope. And then all you got to do is download it.
Well, I'm so happy. that it's doing well for you and for other people. And it's the highest calling, helping other people. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm going to end this right now. I'm pushing stop. Thanks, Frank.
Enough.
That's never enough. It's never enough. Okay, here, I'm stopping it. Bye. All right, thanks, Frank. That was kind of a funny little ending there. We kind of just went, all right, we're done. And we are done. And I want to thank you for listening in. And please come back to the podcast, The Exploding Human. I'm Bob Nickman, and I hope to have you back here checking out another podcast. Thanks.